It's January 2001. George W. Bush is sworn in as the 43rd president of these United States on a platform consisting of mispronouncing the word nuclear,
denuclearization,
and not wanting America to act as the world police. We'll see how long that lasts. AOL and Time Warner merge, but decide to continue sending shitty CDs for people to install the internet. Yes, you heard that right. You used to have to install the internet to your computer. The concept has not aged well. The internet was a nascent thing. Meme culture wouldn't exist for almost another 10 years. Instead of sending pictures with texts on them to our friends, we simply quoted lines of our favorite movies to each other as jokes.
I like you. I like sex. It's nice.
Leading many millennials to have a sense of humor consisting entirely of references. It was a dark, dark time. Now, we all know what happened later that year. If you were alive and remember that time, then you know how much 9/11 infiltrated everyday life, culture, art, and everything in between. How bloodthirsty it made everyone, even the left. Even previous anti-war advocates were gunning for war.
Oh my God.
What's our 6-7 floors are taken out?
It's January 2001. My mom and sisters were getting their nails done at the mall, basically a bi-weekly ritual for us, which meant that I had to tag along. Though I would usually find an excuse to sneak away, ideally to get a pretzel and lemonade at Auntie Anne's, if I didn't play around too much in the stores. Did anybody else hide in the middle of those circular clothes racks and pretend to be like a secret agent? Or was that just me? But usually I'd go to the bathroom, which was just an excuse to walk all the way across the mall. As a 10-year-old, it was pretty cool to be able to walk the mall alone. Simple joys. But on this day, I noticed a poster on the wall of the Sam Goody store. For those of you who were born too late, Sam Goody sold physical media like cassette tapes and CDs. The poster was for Final Fantasy X. At the time, I still hadn't finished 8, but I was already in love with it. And this new game, well, if the poster was anything to go by, it looked awesome. It featured the main character, Titus, looking up with a confident smirk on his face, standing in the ocean and holding a sword that looked to be made of liquid water somehow. It was really, really cool, and it was the first time in my young life that I experienced hype for a product. I only had to wait another 6 months. 6 short months. An eternity. After the smashing success of Final Fantasy VII, and to a lesser degree 8 and 9, Square Enix and Final Fantasy had finally cemented their popularity, indeed that of JRPGs overall, in the West. Given that, Square set out to make their most ambitious game yet, Final Fantasy X. Just like 7 and 8, and seemingly all the best games from my childhood, 10 was helmed by the great Yoshinori Kitase, and man, he really knocked the game out of the park this time. When asked why the game feels so different to previous entries, Kitase cites the capability of the PS2 hardware to create an experience that more closely resembles a realistic film drama. And perhaps because of that groundbreaking capability, he was directly involved in much of the project, personally tweaking animations and basically creating the entire Blitzball minigame himself. It seems like he and the entire team, to be fair, really wanted to flex their creative muscles, and it really shows. Kitase and his team weren't playing around. They pulled out all the stops for this entry. The game would be featured on the new PS2 console, which was itself exploding in sales, later to become the greatest selling console of all time. And it would feature graphics that blew all their previous attempts out of the water, making Final Fantasy VII look like your grandmother made it. It would be the first game in the series to feature voice acting. It would go back to the basics in combat, adopting a true turn-based system, eschewing the active time battle direction that the previous entries experimented with. It would feature a story with some of the most fully realized characters ever seen in a Final Fantasy game, and plot that was basically centered and driven by those characters' wants and needs, rather than the other way around. It would do all of that and probably have the most innovative and complex minigame mode in Blitzball. The hype train had fully left the station and was barreling its way towards July, or so I had hoped. Unfortunately for me, I would have to wait another year or so to be able to play the game. Unlike Final Fantasy VIII, I don't remember the specific events that led to my purchasing the game. Instead, what sticks out in my mind is completely blowing through spring break of my 6th grade year, and the better part of that summer as well, all dedicated to playing Final Fantasy X. One of my sisters had moved out of the house, so I got to take over her old room and furniture and had for the first time a TV in my bedroom that was bigger than my head and that I could play video games on. Needless to say, I didn't leave that room for much of anything while I played the game. I was engrossed. Even 20 years later, I still remember feeling grown up for some reason. Being able to play a video game in my own room and ignoring the siren's call of my friends wanting to play in the very beautiful spring weather. Sorry you guys, but I'm an adult now and I've got adult responsibilities like battling flans. So, now's the time I should say that I don't have the same relationship with 10 like I did with 8. I never created a guide for the game. I only played it twice through when I was much younger. Yet I still hold dear some of the game's bigger moments, and of its place as a great step forward in gaming. So in this video, I will be revisiting Final Fantasy X, analyzing the story, the battle systems and aeons, the world design and art style, and of course, Blitzball. And I want to see if those moments hold up, if the game is as good as I remember. I'm going to start with the story, so spoiler warnings for anyone who hasn't played this game. The video is separated into sections, so skip ahead to the next one if you don't want to be spoiled. Alright, so if you know my videos, then you know the drill. If you're new here, here's how we're going to do things. I am going to give an admittedly very long recap of the story and sprinkle in my own critique and analysis as we go. Okay, let's do this. The story of Final Fantasy X is, as I said, much more character-driven than most Final Fantasy games I have played. Rather than the party of friends being at the mercy of events happening around them for the majority of the story, caught up in something that seems larger than life, Final Fantasy X, for the most part, follows these characters as they make their way on a quest, left to their own devices to determine a path forward. The result is a game that feels more grounded than previous entries, which is a nice change of pace, and complements the greater depth achieved in the dialogue writing and voice acting. The story is about Titus, a famous Blitzball player and wearer of yellow shirts and asymmetrical overalls with jorts. His alcoholic father's abuse scarred his childhood, and even when he traveled through time, and space, his father followed. Rather than literally confronting the man, he is confronting his avatar, the giant monster that he has become both literally and metaphorically within Titus's psyche. Really, Final Fantasy X is just a story of a young man coming to terms with who he is, coming out from under the shadow of his abusive, famous father. He is confronting his demons, but more literally, with fantasy monster stand-ins. The game begins with a cutscene in media res, as the main party sits around a campfire at the end of their journey, just before their final confrontation with Sin and back where it all began. As they sit there, our protagonist, Titus, reflects on this quest he's embarked on. We then flash back to the same place, but in a different time. The once gorgeous, futuristic city of Zanarkand. Titus is already a very famous Blitzball player living in this metropolis, which is ostensibly the most famous sport in the world, and this makes him, in turn, a very famous person indeed. He is also extremely arrogant, childish, and lacks really any kind of subtlety. Honestly, for much of the game, Titus is pretty unlikable as a character. One of his big character arcs is just learning not to be so much of a little shit. We see him beginning a game of Blitzball, which is played in a giant sphere of water, suspended in the middle of an arena. However, just as he is about to shoot the ball, a giant unexplained wave sweeps in and knocks out part of the city. A great cataclysm has come, and its name is Sin. Above the destruction of the city stands a mysterious man dressed in red and holding a giant sword on one shoulder, a la Guts from Berserk. He is seemingly the only person unfazed by the destruction. This man, Auron, meets Titus as he is escaping the Blitzball arena and immediately takes charge, telling Titus to follow him. However, before they leave, time briefly stops and Titus is greeted by a young boy that will be seen throughout the game in flashbacks, seemingly observing events as they unfold.
It begins.
What?
Don't cry.
Auron leads them through the broken city, battling beasts called Sin Spawn. Basically, they are the Demodex of Sin. Fun fact, in case you didn't know, human faces are the home of a colony of mites called Demodex. Yes, that means you too. Your face is covered in microscopic bugs. Can you feel them now that I alerted you to their existence? Anyway, Titus fights with the longsword that Auron had gifted him, a present from his father, Jet. But soon they reach the heart of the cataclysm, the godlike form of Sin, and Auron, speaking to Sin, allows them both to be sucked into its butthole.
You are sure? This is it. This is your story.
Some indeterminate time later, Titus wakes up in the ancient flooded ruins of some long-dead civilization. He isn't there long though, as just when he is being attacked by some of the local fauna, a mysterious figure arrives to help. This is Riku, a member of the Albed and a scavenger. Riku helps Titus fend off the creature and takes him back to her ship. Titus isn't able to understand any of the Albed language, nor do any of them care enough about Titus to try communicating. Nobody except Riku, that is, who discloses that she can actually speak his tongue. She reveals to him that Zanarkand was destroyed by Sin a millennia before, implying to Titus that he had time traveled. Also, she says that Zanarkand, in her time, is a holy site of ruins, so it would be best if he didn't go around telling people that's his home. His stay on the ship isn't long either, however, and after a short mission underwater, Sin once again appears, knocking Titus overboard. And again, Titus wakes up in an unknown place, this time in crystal blue water on the beach of Besaid Island. This tropical paradise is where the story proper begins. Upon waking, Titus is greeted by members of the Besaid Oryx, the local Blitzball team. In particular, the leader, Waka, is especially welcoming, traveling with him to the village, deeper into the island, so that he can maybe find somebody that knows him.
I'm Waka, coach and captain of the Besaid Oryx, brother. What, you hungry?
Waka is a darker-skinned man, rocking an especially choice romper and a blue bandana barely holding back a tall shock of orange hair. He is also a man of blacks and whites, either completely relaxed and joking or totally serious, unwilling to budge on anything, at least when we first meet him. Waka, along with virtually all of the world of Spira, are Yevonites, which is a religion based around the worship of an ancient Zanarkandian summoner named Yu Yevon. The Church of Yevon is, to my knowledge, the most detailed religion to appear in a Final Fantasy game. We learn about its hierarchy, its influence and history, and practices all throughout the game, and it's expanded upon even more in the sequel and spin-offs. The religion is basically a form of Luddism, rejecting nearly all technology. Any use of machina, as they call it, will supposedly incur the wrath of Sin, which destroys towns and kills citizens with barely a thought. It is based on the belief that Sin is a punishment set upon Spira in retribution for the destruction caused by Machina in the ancient war between Zanarkand and Bevel, two great powers of their time. The Church's hierarchy can be seen and felt in all regions of Spira, helmed by the Grand Maester and administered by the Lesser Maesters, such as Seymour. Its prayer is a copy of the Blitzball victory gesture from Titus's time. We'll get into more detail as more of the church is revealed throughout the story. In Besaid Village, Titus meets the rest of the game's party, Yuna, Lulu, and Kimari. A few minutes ago, when I said that the story was about Titus, I'm sure a bunch of Final Fantasy nerds started furiously writing their comments. Well, you can stop. I just buried the lead a little bit. See, Final Fantasy X is just as much the story of Yuna. She is the party's summoner and healer, calling down powerful avatars called Aeons to fight for her. She is much more reserved than Titus, much more proper, though she also lives in the shadow of her famous father, the Grand Summoner Braska. Yet, rather than traveling to Zanarkand to step out from her father's shadow, her goal is to travel under it and take her place beside him. She does all of this out of an overpowering sense of duty. Her personal feelings don't really come into play in the decision. And so, the two, Titus and Yuna, are each other's perfect foil. He is the boisterous type, wearing his emotions on his sleeves. He helps her to get out of her monkish behavior, to just be herself and decide her own fate. At the same time, Yuna is an anchor for Titus's flightfulness. She helps him to see that he doesn't need to be a loner, that he can trust others, that they won't leave him the way his father did. Kimari is a giant beastly humanoid from the race called Ronso. He is the strong silent type, even though that role is sort of already taken by Auron. But he is more of a stronger, silenter type. We don't learn much about him until much later, so we'll discuss him more then. For now, all we know is that he is fiercely protective of Yuna. Finally, there's Lulu, who likely awakened many straight boys and gay girls alike, nearly single-handedly creating the fantasy of the big titty goth GF. She is the magic user of the party, and sort of the group mom. She and Auron are the two level-headed party members most of the time. She had a relationship with Wakka's brother, Chapu, who ran off to join a group of defenders against sin called the Crusaders. She believes that Wakka is only helping Titus because he reminds him of Chapu. She is basically Yuna's older sister also, and so joins the party as one of her guardians so that she can continue to watch over and protect Yuna. I'll discuss these side characters somewhat throughout, but I'm going to be mainly focusing on Titus and Yuna, as Final Fantasy X is really their story. Titus meets all of them as he goes into the temple cloister to try saving Yuna when it appears that she may not emerge from her trial. These trials test the determination and strength of would-be Grand Summoners, and in exchange grant power in the form of Aeons. However, there are strict rules involved as it is a religious rite, and Titus's presence is not wanted by the rest of the party, who together act as Yuna's guardians. Eventually, though, Yuna does emerge. After exiting the temple and showing off her newly acquired Aeon, called Valifor, Yuna and her guardians set out on a pilgrimage to Zanarkand. At the same time, they plan to gather up Aeons from the other temples across Spira, all in an effort to perform the final summoning, which is a ritual that supposedly defeats sin, temporarily at least. Though they argue about it, Wakka lets Titus tag along with the Guardians and the Aurochs to the giant Blitzball tournament in Luca to see if someone recognizes him. He still doesn't believe Titus came from Zanarkand, though. They board a ship called the SS Leaky and set sail. So Titus is already starting to annoy me a bit, which I think was at least somewhat intentional for the story. Riku explicitly told him to keep his mouth shut about being from Zanarkand, and thus far he's pretty much told half his team. By contrast, I think Yuna starts out as the much more interesting character, because she is someone so dedicated, yet mysteriously somber too. Of course, this whole dynamic will change before the end of the game. Along the way, they stop at Kilika Village to visit a temple there and acquire the Aeon Ifrit. But just before they arrive, disaster strikes. Sin attacks the ship, and though Titus and the others fend it off, they are unable to completely set it off course. And as a result, Kilika Port is leveled. When the ship reaches the docks, Yuna displays one of the functions of a summoner, the sending. This is a ritual which literally sets free the souls of the dead. Otherwise, according to Lulu, they will become restless and turn into monsters. After the sending and the temple, the party once again sets sail, once again Luca-bound. This time, the journey is decidedly quieter. The arrival in Luca is one of the best cutscenes in Final Fantasy, period. No matter what, these games never fail at creating a world full of visual wonder. The view of a ship entering a port on a calm sea, Tidus looking out the side at the city sparkling in the distance. This is probably where I first fell in love with the game, and felt that I was entering something much larger than myself. Arriving nearly simultaneously as Yuna's party is the Grand Maester, along with Maester Seymour. As his title implies, Seymour is one of the upper members of the church's hierarchy, and he is clearly beloved and revered by the people. He is half Guado on his father's side, half human on his mother's. From the minute you see Seymour, it is clear that he is going to be an antagonist, though the game tries to obscure the fact at first. He just has this extremely punchable smirk perpetually on his face, and it just screams evil. Also, he has the weirdest fucking hair. I mean, I know this is Final Fantasy, and there's some weird dudes out there, but what the fuck is this shit? It looks like his hair has mantis arms. The streets of Luca are filled with Blitzball fans as a major tournament is being held in the city, with teams from all over the world, including the Besaid Oryx, who apparently have not won a game in 23 years. Waka recruits Tidus to play for the Oryx, and because I, Meryl Morphic, am the greatest Blitzball player who has ever lived, the Oryx actually win the tournament. I even beat the Albed Sykes. I don't think anyone has ever done that before. Probably. After that game, though, the Albed were apparently sore losers, and so they kidnapped Yuna. Tidus and company follow them to the docks to rescue her, during which he discovers that Yuna is half Albed. This is a secret that Lulu and Yuna have been hiding from Waka, as he doesn't really like the Albed. He is kind of racist against them.
Don't tell Waka about Yuna's lineage.
I gotta tell Waka.
I thought I told you not to tell Waka. Oh!
The Albed have no qualms against technology, as evidenced by their usage of Machina, like the robots that attacked the party, or the ship that Riku was on at the beginning. But again, tech is banned by the church, so this makes them heretics, and thus outcast by the rest of society. They, like many fictional races, are analogs to the Romani nomads of Eurasia. As if that weren't enough though, during the championship match, monsters attack the arena. Auron, who has also come to the tournament, reveals himself to Tidus, and they fight their way through the cacophony. However, there are just too many for them to handle, and so Maester Seymour, a summoner like Yuna, comes to the rescue with his Aeon, Anima. That's Anima, not Inima. That's something else entirely. After settling things down, Auron quits being a creepy stalker and actually joins the party as one of Yuna's guardians. They set off onto the Mihin High Road, on to the next temple. However, there are a couple of important character moments that happen before. The first is between Auron and Tidus. The old swordsman reveals that Tidus's father, Jecht, gave his life to ensure that Lord Braska was successful in the last cycle. However, in doing so, he actually became Sin.
Is he alive?
It depends on what you mean by alive. He is no longer human. But then, I felt something object there in that shell. Couldn't you?
It's not clear exactly what this means or how it happened, but somehow Tidus understands, after some whining, and realizes that he was able to feel Jecht within Sin. It also explains why Sin seems to keep popping up wherever Tidus is. The second moment is between Tidus and Yuna, and it takes a lot of undeserved flack. This laugh in particular is clipped out of context all the time. usually as an example of how terrible they think the game's voice acting is. First of all, the voice acting is pretty okay in this game. Maybe not the best, but yeah, pretty okay, and even really good in some places. Especially considering that full voice acting in a game of this scale was basically unheard of up to this point. But also, the laugh that people make fun of is supposed to sound kind of stupid. Let me explain. Titus is feeling down after hearing the news about Jet, and mirroring a previous scene where he tries to encourage Yuna, she cheers him up by forcing him to smile and laugh. She is basically telling him that the way she copes is to just smile anyway, even when life is getting her down, which is honestly really depressing. She isn't able to openly express her emotions. She is under so much pressure to succeed and be a model to her people that she doesn't really have time to be happy for herself. Instead, she just fakes it until she makes it. However, having Titus with her reveals the absurdity of it all, of their situation, of her obligation, and of just standing on a city walkway fake laughing until they both fall into peals of actual laughter.
You probably shouldn't laugh anymore.
About this interaction, Yoshinori Kitase says,
"Even in the real world, actions taken by two people in a budding romance are generally embarrassing memories when you look back on them. I believe that this scene depicts that mental state very well. This scene is of course still made fun of by fans, but I imagine that it is because it greatly touched something in everyone's heart for it to be such a memorable scene, even after 18 years.
It is truly a beautiful scene, and all of the voice acting, including the fake laughter, in the whole context of the scene is actually fantastic. It's a real shame that it's so unfairly maligned. After these scenes play out, the group begin to travel down the Mihin High Road, headed towards Jose Temple, now with both Titus and Oren officially as new guardians of Yuna. After traveling a ways, the party stops at a roadside way station to rest. There, Yuna and Titus share yet another moment alone. With the sea lapping against the rocks in the background, Yuna tells him of the ultimate goal of their pilgrimage, about the final summoning, defeating Sin, and about the Xanarkin in this time. She has a lot on her mind, obviously, and Titus once again tries to cheer her up. It's like they go back and forth. He asks Yuna about her plans once they defeat Sin, and she is reticent to answer, simply brushing off the question. A first-time player might just think this is Yuna being unassuming as usual. But once you know that the summoner must die in order to defeat Sin, it recontextualizes her entire character. She probably wasn't always so somber, so serious, but that knowledge of what she must do weighs on her. That's why it feels so warm in those moments, when her playful side comes through. And yes, I'm bringing this back up because I'm still salty about the laugh shenanigans. Looking at you, Donkey. Along the way, their progress is halted due to an operation against Sin, being conducted by the Crusaders, the group that Wakka's brother had joined, and the Al-Bed. Though even the unlikely allies aren't the most notable thing about the operation. That is because their plan involves the use of machina cannons to shoot at Sin, and the entire thing has been approved by the church and is being looked over by Maester Seymour. The entire ordeal pisses off Wakka, and he even explodes on an old acquaintance. As I mentioned before, he doesn't do well with shades of gray. To him, no Yevon-fearing individual can have anything to do with machina, yet here is his church, approving of this blasphemous behavior. Oren doesn't believe that the cannons will work at all. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be any strong opinions on the matter among the party. Seymour gives an excuse for the church's approval of the mission, but he clearly knows something he isn't saying, and the whole ordeal just feels wrong somehow, even from the outset. The cannons have no real effect on Sin. Big surprise, except for pissing him off. Because of course, other people can't confront our demons for us. And since Sin is just a metaphor for those demons, Titus and Yuna have to be the ones to face down the beast. The behemoth destroys all of the cannons and splits off a piece of himself to attack the embankment, and it is up to Titus and the party to halt the thing's rampage. The operation is a catastrophe, as the battlefield is littered with Crusaders and Al-Bhed alike who died in vain, their best efforts amounting to nothing at all. After the encounter on Mushroom Rock, the party regroups and continues on to Jose Temple. There, they go through a cloister of trials, as they do at every temple, which we will discuss later, and they obtain Ixion, the Aeon. They also meet another summoner, one of a few along their journey who are also on their own quest to become the Grand Summoner. It is all kind of a competition. Next, the pilgrimage travels across the Moonflow, a large body of water, towards Guadosalam, the Guado capital, on a shoe puff. Along the way, Yuna is once again captured by the Al-Bhed, only this time Riku reveals herself to Yuna before the party catches up. She and the other Al-Bhed were trying to capture Yuna to protect her for mysterious reasons. Thus, Yuna deems that Riku's motives were pure, so she is added as yet another guardian for her. Yuna is still keeping the truth from him about her Al-Bhed blood. I'm not sure how I feel about this. In general, secrets can be kind of a crutch used by writers to artificially create drama. For example, secrets are the bread and butter for CW shows. It's the same sort of tired trope as supposedly smart people in horror films acting extremely stupid to further the plot.
Can you try and distract it?
Yes. I'll see if I can interest it in the wand.
As in, they both make me roll my eyes. I think it would have been better to reveal it much earlier, or to have it not be a secret at all, but instead show Waka dealing with it, having complex emotions on the matter that are eventually resolved. I mean, we do kind of get this later on, but it doesn't really have the time to breathe, in my opinion. I don't think it really even makes sense, since Braska was a well-known figure, enough to make even Yuna a minor celebrity. So how did they not already know who her mother was, or at least what her heritage was? Eventually, though, the party arrives in Guadosalam, where the plot really begins to kick into high gear. Seymour invites them, Yuna especially, to his home, as he has a proposal for them. When they accept and enter, he begins by showing them a sphere, basically a video recording of the first Grand Summoner Yunalesca and her husband, Lord Zayon. It is an ancient memory which depicts the long-dead city of Zanarkand. Turns out, Seymour's proposal is a literal one. He wants to marry Yuna to mirror Yunalesca and Zayon. He explains away his intentions as wanting to give the people of Spira hope, that the daughter of the previous High Summoner and a well-respected maester are united in service to the people. But, I mean, come on. Look at this guy. He acts way too suspicious to not have ulterior motives. Yuna is, unsurprisingly, taken aback by the proposal, as the two have only ostensibly interacted like twice ever, and so she tells him that she'll think about it. In the meantime, the party visits the Far Plane through a portal within Guadosalam. The Far Plane is basically the spirit realm of the Final Fantasy X universe, where the dead gather, and where the living can come to visit to see their loved ones one last time. Titus sees his mother, but not his father. He had always thought that his father had gone missing and died, but him not appearing in the afterlife verifies to Titus that Jecht is indeed still alive, and seemingly confirmed what Auron had told him about Jecht becoming Sin. The others see their families as well, though Riku and Auron both stayed back on the other side of the portal for their own reasons. In Auron's case especially, it's a very good one. He is an unsent, a spirit which has neither crossed over to the Far Plane nor turned into a monster, instead walking the earth indistinguishable to a living person, except that they're effectively immortal. So walking into the Far Plane would be tantamount to suicide for Auron, except he is already dead, technically. Look, it's all pretty complicated, just trust me on this. Yuna notes to Titus that despite his mother not undergoing ascending by a summoner, she still wound up in the Far Plane, because she must have accepted her death. One reason he hated his father so much is that his mother seemingly lost the will to live after Jecht went missing. Despite everything Jecht had put him through, the abuse, the drunkenness, she still loved him. In a very real way, she chose her dead husband over her still alive young child. This is a good point to bring up one of my main problems with this story, which is its depiction of Jecht. His story starts out very strong, giving us good reason to hate him, and later shows us that he did love Titus in his own way. Yet, rather than him staying this complicated but ultimately toxic character, the game tends to look on him more favorably towards the end. To be fair to his character arc, Jecht did seem to go through a transformation on that journey, but all of that was completely away from Titus. And since the writers needed him to be this noble hero at the end for whatever reason, despite never actually making things right with his son, much of his abuse is just hand-waved away as tough love, or not really addressed at all. By the end of the game, it is by and large forgotten. Anyway, back in the plot, Seymour's dead father Jiskel walks out of the far plane, becoming an unsent himself. Una performs ascending, and while Jiskel goes into the afterlife, a sphere recording is left behind. Una then goes to speak to Seymour, but he has already left the village. So the party continues their journey, traveling through the Thunder Plains and into Macalania Woods. Whatever. Along the way, there is much discussion regarding Seymour's proposal. Una apparently is leaning towards accepting it. Again, from her perspective, she is basically a walking dead woman. She is simply a vessel to fulfill the needs of Spira. Almost not even human, but a tool that she has fashioned herself into. So even though Una clearly doesn't want to marry Seymour or have any romantic interest in him, she still plans to accept his offer. And Titus clearly doesn't like this. He doesn't really try to hide his thirst for Una through the entire game, and she pretty much reciprocates. Yet none of that changes her mind. Interesting fact about the Thunder Plane that you may not know, thunder and lightning strikes are a pretty common occurrence there. In fact, lightning will strike the player every few seconds unless they dodge out of the way, which is a bespoke mechanic only for this area. There is a quest later that requires Titus to dodge the lightning 200 times, and I cannot express to you the pain of getting like 170 dodges, then flubbing one and having to restart. I can't express it because I only did it once as a kid, and the only thing I remember about my feelings on the quest is a general fuck that. And I didn't try it again on this playthrough because fuck that. Riku is pretty terrified of the lightning though. So the group rests again at another way stop, during which they watch the sphere that Jiskel left, and learn the horrible truth behind the former Guado leader's death. If Seymour acting sus wasn't enough of an indication of his true character, the sphere leaves no room for doubt that he is not a good dude. He committed patricide, murdering his father in cold blood to take control of the Guado in preparation for his mysterious ends. I know that the beginning of that sentence was kind of redundant. I just wanted an excuse to say patricide. And yes, by the way, I am aware that the sequels and spin-offs flesh out Seymour's story more, showing that he is yet another character that has daddy problems and more complicated than the original lets on, namely being exiled by Jiskel because his people were racist. But I want to focus on the information we get in this game. Even with that knowledge of Seymour's true self, Una still announces to the group that she will accept Seymour's proposal, though Auron believes that she has something else up her sleeve. Titus and co. finally arrive in Macalania Woods, fuck it, I don't know how to pronounce it, whatever, where they find a sphere left behind by Jecht. It's one of those moments that adds complexity to his character that I mentioned before. I'm sorry if you're a Jecht fan. I will say he is a complicated character, neither totally bad nor good, just very human. I just personally don't like how the game tries to feed the player sentimental goodbye messages and effectively whitewash the clear abuse Titus suffered. I think that Titus actually grappling with that history would have been a much more interesting story to tell rather than this one of redemption off screen. It would have more neatly mirrored the literal battle taking place between the pilgrimage and sin. The party is traveling within the Macarena woods accompanied by Seymour's assistant, Trommel, who they met there. But then the Albed, once again, attack the party. However, this time, Riku's brother is among the kidnappers, which kind of ends up spilling the beans about Riku's bloodline. Waka immediately becomes distrustful of her, but she's been using Machina in battle this entire time. Her best attack is basically just engineering weapons from random shit that the party finds. It's hard to imagine that the thought never crossed his mind, yet he acts completely surprised. Then again, this is a Final Fantasy game, where characters often either have the observational capabilities of Jason Bourne, or are as gullible as a sack of puppies. There really isn't much in between. Yet, despite the revelation, Yuna still hides her own Albed lineage from him. And you know my thoughts on that. Within Malhamia Temple, a battle between the party and Seymour occurs when they confront him, letting him know that they know about Jiskel. He turns on Yuna, and so they are forced to battle and ultimately kill him. Or so they believe. Just after they finish, Seymour's assistant Trommel walks in. And from his perspective, he just witnessed the real-world equivalent of a parishioner killing a bishop. But like in the Middle Ages when the church still held political power. That he doesn't take it well and attempts to arrest them all, so the party is forced to flee. In their flight, they end up falling through the ice of the frozen Lake Makalaya and land on a sleeping Sin at the bottom of the temple. As the behemoth wakes, the group falls unconscious, only to wake up far away on the desert island of Baikonur. The island is the secret home of the Albed, and at the island's center, they control a large mechanical fortress. The party starts out separated, unaware of where they have found themselves, but eventually they find each other and make their way to the fortress. Everyone, that is, except for Yuna, who was apparently taken while they were unconscious on Sin. This isn't the gameplay section, but I do want to note that we don't just rely on the characters' reactions to tell us how to feel about Yuna's disappearance. Her absence can clearly be felt, since up to this point, she will be the party's only healer, outside of weak potions. Luckily, Riku steps in with some really convenient Albed potions, which only she can use. But still, it can be rough going without Yuna. Plus, she is best girl. When they arrive at the fortress, the entire place is under siege, the attackers already inside the building causing havoc with monsters. The aggressors in the battle are the Guado, who are invading because of the recent summoner kidnappings. As the party fights through the battle, trying to find Yuna amidst the mayhem, they wind up finding two of the other summoners that they'd met on their journey, Donna and Usaru. Donna being the character who wears the assless chaps with the thong. Bold choice. They too had been kidnapped by the Albed. However, they inform the party that Yuna isn't there. Instead, they end up finding out that Seymour's forces had taken her to the capital city of Bevel. Finally, the full truth comes out. Riku reveals the real reason that they had been kidnapping summoners, to protect them from the final summoning, from the certain death they face. The party is met by the Albed leader Cid, who helps them escape the Guado attack via a giant airship, the Fahrenheit. Fun fact that I didn't know until this playthrough, this is actually the ship that Titus helped Riku salvage at the very beginning of the game. I have to gush again at the cutscenes in this game. This one of the Fahrenheit taking off is so gorgeous, with all the sand and smoke kicking up into the clouds around it, and then seeing the ship rocket away, bursting through the cloud in a fury. I'm just a sucker for sci-fantasy airships, so I don't have a perspective of objectivity, but I mean, come on, just look at that. Aboard the ship, more secrets are revealed. Even with the explanation of the Albed wanting to save the summoners from their doom at the final summoning, they seem to pay extra attention to Yuna to an almost annoying degree. No, scratch that, definitely annoying degree. Even having one of their own join her pilgrimage as a guardian. This was not by accident. Cid, it turns out, is Yuna's uncle on her mother's side, making Riku her cousin. Given all of that, they are motivated to help rescue Yuna. So right away, Titus directs them to go to Bevel, as they have caught word that Seymour is still somehow alive. And that is where he is holding Yuna. They arrive in sort of a cliche scene, right when the forced marriage between Seymour and Yuna is supposed to take place. I say forced because despite Yuna agreeing to the arrangements, she is doing so under duress. Seymour basically promises to kill Titus and the others if she denies him the union, and their arrival only makes the threat more real when they are inevitably captured. Thus, Yuna is forced to proceed with the ceremony, for now. Titus and company try to plead their case to the Grand Maester Micah, who is also present for the ceremony. However, he reveals that it isn't just Seymour that is corrupt, but the entire church. They didn't just tacitly approve of the Al-Bed using their machina against sin at Mushroom Rock, they actively encouraged it. Even worse, the hypocrites employ forces that use machina themselves, which Titus and the others fight through to reach Yuna. But even worse is the fact that Seymour is an unsent, not a living human, just like Oren and his father Jiskel. He is trying to cling to life and manipulate the living world for his own gain. He plans to use sin to destroy the world so that it can end the people's pain, the pains of life and all the associated suffering. Despite that, the Grand Maester is bewilderingly still on Seymour's side. I will say that I had mostly forgotten the details of the story this time around and was pretty much blindsided by the Grand Maester's corruption. Unlike Seymour, the foreshadowing is much more subtle with him. As the ceremony finishes, Yuna seizes the moment and runs up to the edge of the platform, which is on top of a skyscraper for some reason. Actually, I say that, but a wedding on top of the Sears Tower sounds baller as fuck. Yuna threatens to throw herself off the side if Seymour doesn't let her friends go, and she isn't bluffing. In fact, she does it anyway, and she dies on impact. Game over. I'm only kidding, obviously, but Yuna is a badass, and so during her fall, summons Valifor to scoop her up and fly her away, escaping Seymour and the church. I really like the way this scene exhibits Yuna's agency. Basically, every big decision here was made by her, and it was by her action that the team was able to escape unscathed. It shows off her cleverness, which will be needed in the story to come. She meets up with the others inside the futuristic Bavel Temple, a place of glittering lights and levitating platforms, and at the end they obtain the Aeon Bahamut. But right afterwards they are caught by church forces and put on trial, so that didn't last long. There is a mask-off moment in the trial when we find out that the Grand Maester, like Seymour, is an unsent, and his actions as the head of the church have been self-serving this entire time, to prevent his own sending and, again, manipulate the world to his own gain. The entire Church of Yevon is rotten to the core. They have been lying to the people basically since its inception. In fact, the only person that seems to be on the pilgrimage's side, Maester Kelk Ronso, withholds judgment from the Grand Maester, and instead takes his leave from the trial. Things don't go well for the party. They are judged guilty and sentenced to incarceration in the Via Purifico dungeon. But let me tell you, this has got to be the worst jail in the history of jails. It is a massive network of sewers and aqueducts underneath Bavel that the church haphazardly remodeled into a dungeon. The party, split into two groups, is basically free to roam the facility, which apparently the Grand Maester is confident they can't escape from, despite it inexplicably having working teleport pads and a sort of accessible exit. I mean, they do get help from Isaru, and they do have to fight a boss monster and lots of smaller ones. Actually, on second thought, they were more likely sent down there in an indirect execution by monster, or that is what was expected at least. Nevertheless, after escaping via Purifico and Bavel itself, the party travels back through Marana Woods on their way to the Calmlands, the final leg of their journey. It is the first time since learning Yuna's ultimate fate, should she perform the final summoning, that Titus has been able to speak with her alone. There is a pretty wonderful scene between the two that happens within the woods. Titus feels ashamed of himself for so ignorantly encouraging Yuna to finish her quest to beat sin, basically pushing her to kill herself without really knowing it. So he changes tack and tries to convince her to stop, to give up her self-appointed duty and basically run away with him. He really lets his feelings for her come out more than ever here, and she returns in kind. They have been making eyes at each other for nearly the entire game, as I mentioned, but this is the most direct they have spoken to one another. And for the moment, Yuna allows herself to dream, to consider. She wonders what the others would say, but Titus assures her that no matter what, they will come around. They all care for her deeply. And she wonders what her life would look like, what she would do if she wasn't bound by her goal to become the Grand Summoner. But ultimately, she gives up the thought. Her strong sense of duty will not allow her to live the life she so clearly, desperately wants with Titus. Still though, even being able to dream of a different life, of being happy, is more than she ever had been able to do before. And it is thanks to Titus. In yet another breathtakingly beautiful, fully rendered cutscene, Yuna breaks into quiet sobbing as Titus holds her. And then, the two share a kiss in the pond underneath a tree, drenched in moonlight. It is a truly wonderful scene. While the feelings between the two were almost immediate, it is refreshing to see such an openly romantic moment between them. Oftentimes in Final Fantasy, and honestly most anime, writers can be coy with romance, possibly because of the differences in cultures and the way we display affection. But in this scene, the two are really allowed to act very much human. To my Western sensibilities, it comes off as a more realistic, mature portrayal of romance. And this is something that I look for in anime as I get older. It's the reason that I really enjoyed Beastars, despite not being into the furry angle of the show. No shade if you are, just saying. Another great one for this is Agretsuko. I even have a poster of that in my school office. Anyway, the party eventually makes their way through the forest and enters the Calmlands. I'm not going to say much about this place.
So that was a fucking lie.
Except that, as a kid, I fucking loved the Calmlands. I think it's because of the strong world building in this game and the way this particular area is introduced. The NPCs describe an epic battle long past between Sin and an ancient Grand Summoner that was so cataclysmic that it swept the area clean of everything, leaving a bare plain behind. Something about that little bit of lore, and it really is just a briefly mentioned tidbit, activated so much wonder in me that it stuck around for 20 odd years, and I got really excited entering this area in this playthrough. Also, there are a lot of interesting things hidden in the Calmlands. Celestial weapon parts, a hidden castle, the monster arena, and setting aside the fucking chocobo races, you can ride around the area on a chocobo. It's almost like a tiny overworld. After passing through the Calmlands, though, the party arrives at Mount Gagazet, which is basically the last obstacle to finally reaching their destination, the ruins of Xanarkand. At the base of the mountain, they are greeted by Kelk Ronso, the former maester of the church that left the trial, along with some others of his race. I haven't mentioned Kimahri's story up to now because, well, honestly, there isn't much to it, at least not within the text of this game. But suffice it to say that he's sort of the runt of the Ronso. He was outcast because of his broken horn, which both he and the other Ronso believe to mean that he isn't worthy of being one. This eventually led him to protecting Yuna, though again, exactly how that happened isn't really explained until one of the spin-off games. He is a character with a chip on his shoulder, always with something to prove, which is why he protects a summoner. However, on Gagazet, he proves himself to the other Ronso, and Kelk gives Yuna his blessing to trek their mountain. After traveling up the snow-covered slopes, as they near the summit, Seymour the Unsent intercepts them and engages them in another battle. He reveals that in the time they were summiting the peak, he basically wiped out the Ronso. The ones on the mountain, at least. So Kimahri is supposedly, according to Seymour, the last of his race. This time, Seymour reveals his true form as an Unsent, Seymour Booty. That's what his name is, and you can't convince me otherwise. Despite his best efforts, though, the party is once again victorious in fake killing him. By this point, it's becoming clear that while the game has been positioning Seymour as the main antagonist, that really isn't the case in truth. He is simply a petty creature with grand ambitions and acts more as a hindrance and annoyance to the party than their main threat. At the summit of Gagazet, at the Fountain of the Faith, Titus is taken into one of the visions that he has been experiencing throughout the game. I haven't mentioned these in my analysis really, but they happened fairly regularly throughout the story. Usually, they're seemingly disconnected memories about Titus's childhood in Zanarkand, about his mother and his father and all their issues. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, in the first vision, there is often a young hooded boy somewhere in the background, silently observing the events. However, this time is different, much like that first vision. The child comes out of the haze and speaks to Titus directly, dropping some huge knowledge bombs on your boy. As he explains it, in the ancient war between Zanarkand and Bavel, the summoners of Titus's city realized that they couldn't win. So rather than focusing on the war, they summoned a dream of Zanarkand as it existed, including all its people. This would continue to exist even after the real city was destroyed by sin. To keep it from any interference, they placed the dream out in the middle of the ocean. So this means that Titus, being sent through time, was just a red herring. He was really just transported through space, away from the dream. In fact, sin itself was a creation by the greatest summoner of Zanarkand, Yevon, the same Yevon that is currently being worshipped, to make sure Spira never developed enough to discover the Dream City. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of this revelation, though I'm sure I'll get a bunch of comments telling me why I'm wrong. It just seems like it's such a convoluted plan to create this giant monster to constantly terrorize humanity just to keep them from building ships that could possibly discover Dream Zanarkand. I don't know, just my opinion. However, it also means that Titus himself is a dream, not a living person. His existence is only possible because of the Faith, who themselves are a bunch of trapped ancient citizens of Zanarkand, cursed to continue dreaming the city and its people in perpetuity. The boy is one of the Faith, speaking for them all. In other words, the boy's dream, along with many others, are all keeping Titus quote-unquote alive. And as the boy explains, they are exhausted from doing so. He asks a favor of Titus, to finally defeat sin for good and release the Faith from their bondage. Titus and Yuna are the only ones capable of doing this, as he and his father, who is the current incarnation of sin, have both been touched by the monster, and thus made real in a way. While Titus has slowly, very slowly, become more mature over the course of the story, mostly because of his love for Yuna, it is really at this moment that he becomes a truly likable character. Not because he has decided to sacrifice himself, but because he finally decides to put the needs of others ahead of his own. He decides to help his friends no matter the cost, and on top of that, he doesn't even mention the consequences of doing so to them. Old Titus would have whined incessantly at anyone who would listen, and likely would have made the choice to save himself. It's some really nice character growth. The party finally crosses Gagazet and enters the ruin of Zanarkand, where the Pyreflies, the souls of the ancient dead of the city, swarm all around, showing visions to each of the members. There, in the dome of Zanarkand, they meet Yunalesca, the daughter of Yevon, the first Grand Summoner to perform the final summoning and temporarily defeat sin, an unsent spirit. And within that dome, she tells them the final truth. Not only will the summoner perish in the final summoning, but their chosen guardian is used to create that Aeon, transformed, sacrificed, and finally merging with sin, allowing its eventual rebirth and the cycle to start anew. Yuna breaks at this news. While she is willing to sacrifice herself for Spira, having been resigned to her fate for the entire game, she is not willing to sacrifice Titus, her love, nor her friends. During her argument with Yunalesca, it is revealed that in his grief at the fate of his friends in the last cycle, Oren challenged her. This is how he died, how he became an unsent himself. Yuna calls the summoning a false tradition. She is disgusted with the toll it has taken over the centuries, the anguish it has caused. And for what? An exceedingly brief respite before being terrorized and slaughtered once again? Yuna doesn't accept this. Oren doesn't accept this. And so, neither does the party. They engage in battle with Yunalesca, defeating and finally sending her to the far plane. However, in her last words before passing on, she warns that even if they are successful in finding another way to defeat Sin, her father, Yu Yevon, who still lives eternally inside the monster, will just birth it anew anyway, and nothing will have changed with the world. I really like these mirrored themes of cycles. The destruction and rebirth of Sin is a cycle, enabled by the summoners in the Church of Yevon. Abusive relationships are often cyclical, with the abused suffering from trauma alone and taking it out on those closest to them. By denying her supposed duty to reenact the summoning, Yuna is breaking the cycle of Sin. In the same way, by facing his father on his own terms, Titus is able to break the cycle of abuse and come to grips with his trauma. Now, of course, this is all implicit in just my interpretation. I would have preferred they made things a little bit more explicit, especially in Titus's case. See my gripes with the handling of Jekt before. So the tradition has ended, but now the party needs a new way to defeat Sin, as they just killed off the only known method. I didn't mention it before, but Yunalesca was the only being that could conjure the final Aeon, and without her eternal presence, it is no longer possible to do so. Titus and company travel to Bevel to confront the Grand Maester, and they find the city and the church in the middle of a crisis. They hope Grand Maester Micah may know of another way to defeat Sin. However, he just says he doesn't believe there is any other way. Despite their failure to get answers, they devise a plan, using the fact that Sin is in part Jekt. Titus knows that his father's favorite song is the Hymn of the Faith, a fact established earlier in the story by Oren. They plan on getting all of Spira to sing the song to get up inside Sin's guts when it gets sweepy and yawns uwu, and then battle and defeat Yu Yevon at the monster's core, defeating both Sin and any possibility of it resurrecting. Sound plan, right? And it all seems to work at first. The first part of their plan is successful. They make it inside Sin. But once again, Seymour finds a contrived way to attack them. And really, he just needs to stop. I know these games usually have antagonists that the player fights throughout the game, constantly changing forms and getting stronger, and it's basically a Final Fantasy staple, like Cypher in 8. What's his name from 7? That's a joke, relax. I totally know his name is Sephiroth. But Seymour, he just doesn't do it for me. It's that damn hair, man. I just can't, alright? But also, he's just a pretty cliche bad guy trying to destroy the world because blah blah blah, ending suffering, must destroy to create something new, blah 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 blah. He has no personal stakes in the fight, no real ties to Titus or Yuna, outside his creepy incel lust for her. Overall, he just has no compelling reason to be here, at least as explained in this game, again. But at least he's gone pretty quickly, and Yuna finally sends his ass never to bother us again. They finally reach the core of Sin, and Titus gets to give his father a final goodbye, which, despite my qualms with Jekt's characterization, is a pretty touching scene. Titus has finally stopped running, and instead faces, or rather dives headlong into, the symbol of his demons, a monstrous manifestation of his abusive father. Despite everything that Jekt did, despite the fact that Titus probably should still hate him, at the end of the day, he is his dad. And anyone who has ever had a complicated relationship with a parent, saving for particularly egregious exceptions, will tell you that despite it all, when all the chips had fallen and they reached the end of the road, they are still their mom or their dad, and it still hurts to lose them. The moment doesn't last though, and the last of Jekt's consciousness is absorbed by Sin, and he turns into Braska's final Aeon, who is in turn taken over by Yu Yevon. At long last, Titus, Yuna, and the others confront their true enemy. Yet he is not what they expected. Having lived inside Sin, using his life force, resurrecting it time and time again, the once great summoner has devolved into an automaton, following only his base instincts and desires left over from when he was still himself. And he takes control over the Jekt Aeon because he cannot exist apart from one of those avatars. The party does battle with Yu Yevon, first defeating Braska's Aeon, then Yu begins taking over Yuna's Aeons, one by one, becoming increasingly desperate, but the party defeats them all in turn. And finally, with no more Aeons to inhabit, all that is left is a tiny bug-like creature which Tidus steps on, giving a satisfying crunch. Don't look it up, that's what happens. Sorry, I lost the footage for that part. With the battle won and the world saved, Spira is finally at peace. Sin will no longer be reborn, no longer terrorize the land. No more need for final summonings, no more need for sacrifice. And the Church of Yevon has effectively crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. All of the forces that led humanity down a path of destruction have been removed, and they are left to their own devices to progress in peace until the sequel. With his job complete, Jekt put to rest and Yuna protected, Auron requests that Yuna finally perform his sending, and so he crosses over into the afterlife. Likewise, now that the Faith have been set free and the dream of Zanarkand is no more, Tidus, finally at peace with himself, begins to fade from existence. But not before Yuna, one last time, proclaims her love for him, and they come together into a final embrace. Then he finally disappears, entering the far plane and joining Auron and his mother and father. In the final moments of the game, at some indeterminate time in the future, Grand Summoner Yuna gives a speech, proclaiming Sin dead and the world saved, asking the world not to forget the friends they have lost. And just before the credits roll, we see Tidus surfacing from the ocean. Resurrected? Question mark? Tidus, like Jesus, gave his life to defeating sin. And then, as all life comes from water, he is baptized, brought back, resurrected. In life, he spread a message of hope and happiness to his companions, and they, Yuna especially, who would be like the Mary Magdalene in this analogy, continue to spread it after his death. Well, that ended up being a much longer recap than I intended, about 16, 17 pages worth to be exact, but I think it basically sums up my feelings for the story. Overall, it's fantastic. As I said at the beginning, its characters have infinitely more depth than most other Final Fantasy games, as their choices seem to be dictated more by their personalities, their own wants and needs, instead of what the plot needs in a given moment. It's also made possible by the voice acting, which I maintain is fantastic for the most part, especially with the game basically pioneering voice-acted dialogue at this scale. One thing I haven't mentioned, but that I thought was done really well, is the diversity of the cast. There are some really strong female characters with real agency. They don't just fawn over a dude like Final Fantasy VII. Also, while there aren't any black characters, like we did actually get in Final Fantasy VII, Wakka and the island peoples being of a different skin tone was a nice touch, though I do think a bit more variety and representation couldn't hurt. Looking at you, Final Fantasy XV. Overall, I'd say it did well in the inclusivity department, saving for LGBT characters, of course. This was 2001. There are a few sore spots for me that I noted, like some of the convoluted stuff with Sin's origin, or the lack of depth with Kamari, or the annoyance of Seymour or Jekt. But those are all minor in the grand scheme of things. I still absolutely love this story and got much, much more out of it playing as an adult than I did as a child.
You've really grown.
But anyways, let's finally move on to the gameplay, because there's a lot there too. Final Fantasy X gets back to the roots of the series in quite a few ways, most of all combat. Unlike 8, where any character could fill any role if they had the right GFs and magic, That is not the case in 10, at least not until the very late game after a bunch of grinding. This system is much more traditional. In 10, stats are determined by the sphere grid. Each character starts at a different position on the grid, and each region of the grid is dedicated to a different class. So, though anyone can eventually get anywhere else on the grid for a long while, there aren't too many options for them to veer off course too drastically. So, for example, Lulu is the team's black mage, Titus is the quick hitter, Yuna is the healer, and so on and so forth. This means, on one hand, that most playthroughs will go basically the same way every time, and it somewhat limits the replayability in that regard. And yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the sphere grid itself. There's not a good way to see everything all at once, making it feel kind of haphazard and unintuitive when deciding where to go. Still, I did enjoy the combat even with, and sometimes because of those restricted roles. I think the main reason that it works is due to the ease at which members are able to be switched in and out, and that doing so doesn't use up a turn. Since roles are set and only 3 members are able to be in a fight at a time, the player will often have to switch characters in and out multiple times throughout the battle. Sometimes you'll need to switch Yuna in for healing, but then you want to bring back in Lulu to DPS with magical attacks, or Wakka for long-range foes, or whatever. And when switching, it remains the turn of whoever is in that position, even if you switch in multiple players back to back, which I often did since I played the game at double speed on emulator a lot of the time, and I would annoyingly, inadvertently, hit down twice and swap in the wrong member. Like a lot, actually. It was a self-inflicted problem. Like 8, 10 also came out when the series was still hip-deep in random encounters and monsters popping up to battle out of thin air. The next mainline entry, 12, would finally veer away from that. And though 10 and 12 both came out on the PS2, thus having access to the same hardware, 12 was made much later in the cycle of the console, benefiting from developers understanding how to squeeze every bit of performance out of it. For now though, we are still stuck getting into battles every few steps. And though I have a certain nostalgia for this type of system, after a while it starts to get exhausting. The newer system is just superior in basically every way, I guess, except surprise. But at least towards the end, there's a perk that allows you to skip the encounters entirely. Much of the rest of the battling works the same as any of the other early Final Fantasy games, with pure turn-based combat. However, one thing this game does is add unique mechanics to big battles. For instance, in the battle with the Al Bhed kidnappers on the Luca docks, there is a chance to do a huge amount of damage to their machine by using thunder on a nearby crane, charging it up. After hitting it a few times, it swings over, picks up the machine, and drops it back down, dealing massive damage. Other games in the series have done things like this before, of course. However, 10 does it way more from what I've seen. A large percentage of the boss fights have some sort of extra mechanic, be it controlling the airship for position in battle, or just something as simple as talking to Seymour with Yuna to gain stat advantages. Often, these mechanics are pretty simple and not super engaging, which is a result, I think, of keeping many of them optional, or at least not super critical. Despite that, I still enjoyed most of the mechanics, as they were a decent change of pace to combat, which can become monotonous at times, even in the best games in the series. One thing I particularly enjoyed in 10 is the summoning mechanic. Each Final Fantasy game has a pretty unique take on summoning, like in 8, where GFs perform a single giant attack, or in 12, where the summoner and Esper fight side by side, or in 15, where they do this really cool thing called not fucking work. In 10, not only is Yuna a summoner in the narrative, but she is also the only one in the party capable of summoning an Aeon, which is a great, if obvious, example of the story and gameplay working together to form a cohesive narrative. The Aeons can be summoned at any time during the battle, and when they arrive, the rest of the party outside Yuna disappears. The Aeon battles the enemy alone until either it or the enemy dies, or if it's recalled. It's basically just a superpowered character. I prefer this system over the 1 in 8, as it makes the Aeons feel more real, like they are actually part of the world and really engaging in the combat. They have some pretty cool designs too. I especially like this incarnation of Bahamut, who has the energy of a nightclub bouncer with his arms all crossed, but one that can shoot lasers out of its mouth. Something I'm really not a fan of in 10 are the ultimate moves, or overdrives as they're called in this game. Unlike 8 and many other entries if memory serves, where the ultimate moves are based on health, giving a higher chance of activation when HP is in the red, in 10 there is a separate overdrive gauge that fills up slowly over the course of battle. And when I say slowly, I mean slowly. Like, a character can usually only activate their overdrive once every 4 to 5 normal enemy battles, at least until they get their celestial weapons. They build the gauge up by doing things according to their roles, like damaging an enemy or healing a team member. But my problem isn't just the infrequency of their usage, the actual ultimates themselves are, save for a couple exceptions, pretty underwhelming. Like, for instance, Wakka's ultimate, Slots, is literally just an elemental slot machine, where matching 3 elements does the biggest attack of that element. And that's without mentioning the fact that the attacks themselves aren't very powerful, and don't look super exciting either. Lulu's is just her normal magic attacks, but like more of them, and in quick succession. There are exceptions to this though, and those, in my opinion, are Kimahri, Riku, and the Aeon's overdrives. First, the Aeons have badass overdrives, and Yuna's overdrive is really just automatically giving them theirs. Kimahri is able to learn a bunch of different overdrive moves by using a special move on select monsters called Lancet. It's basically blue magic from Final Fantasy VIII that Quistis had. If done on the correct monsters, it adds a new attack to a list. Most of these aren't too powerful, but there are some gems in there, like Bad Breath, which inflicts all sorts of nasty status effects on the enemy. Riku's is probably the coolest, though. Being of the Albed, the culture known for blaspheming against Yevon by salvaging and working with ancient machina, Riku is an expert salvager. It makes perfect sense. So her overdrive is combined. Side note, her normal attacks, or Mug, can also insta-kill any machina as well. It's a pretty cool touch. Anyway, the overdrive allows her to combine any 2 consumable items together, resulting in all sorts of different attacks. These can range from healing, support, or attack moves, and some of them can be pretty damn powerful. With there being, as us scientists say, like a bajillion different consumable items, it would seem like there are nearly infinite results. Except, of course, that's not actually the case. Some combinations create the same effect, though there are still a lot. Another thing I'm not keen on is the weapon upgrade system. In Final Fantasy X, enemies drop weapons all the time, in addition to those that can be bought from various stores. Even by the time the party makes it to Luca, it's likely that you'll be flooded with weapons. And for some ungodly reason, Square gave us no way to sort weapons or armor, and they're all in the same fucking inventory, and it sucks, especially when I have 2 of the same weapon with different perks. The game just throws them into any free spot, making it hopelessly messy. So I guess I should explain that outburst. See, every weapon or armor piece you get will have 1 or more perk slots. Most of the time, the slots are already filled with 1 or more perks, and any blank ones left can be modded to add more. Only problem is, it's hellishly expensive to upgrade, and even then you don't really get the ability to do so until like midway through the game. It really disincentivizes experimentation. But more to the point, you will need to keep on hand a bunch of different weapons and armor to make sure that you can counter any damage or armor type. At the same time, Gil is seemingly less abundant than in previous titles until the later stages. So when you need to sell redundant weapons, it is absolute hell to sift through the seemingly identical 10 Brotherhood swords or 12 Moomba dolls that you have to find the ones that you actually want to sell, especially because they are scattered throughout the inventory. And again, no way to sort. Now, I almost finished this recording without mentioning the Cloister Trials. These are the puzzles that you have to complete before Yuna can gain an Aeon in a temple, though the player is the one solving them. Basically, Titus has to move spheres and pedestals around in order to open doors and reveal passages. There are different spheres that have different effects when placed in a slot. For the most part, these puzzles were pretty fantastic and had a nice difficulty ramp, ending with some pretty tough ones. One thing I liked in particular was the Makarana temple, which is frozen over and requires special mechanics to solve. Finishing it requires a sort of recursive multi-stage solution that really left me stumped for a long time. Also in every trial, there are destruction spheres. These are optional content and each give a hidden reward when you solve the associated puzzle, separate from the main one in the cloister. Think the hidden treasure chests within Breath of the Wild, but harder. All in all, I enjoyed the cloister puzzles, and they were a nice addition to the game. So those are most of the normal gameplay mechanics, and even though I was pretty negative about more than a few aspects here, I still really enjoyed my playthrough. Going through the main story and the battles therein still holds up today. Now, onward to the special stuff. I gotta come clean. This playthrough, I only did a few of the many available side quests, so this section is going to be shorter than the rest. But there is a very good reason for that, in my opinion. Everything in this fucking game is a grind. Wanna get secret Aeons? Grind. Wanna get ultimate weapons? Good for you, get to grinding. Want to just fight some cool monsters in the battle arena? Well, my friend, you should just fill yourself up with peppercorns since you're gonna be grinding anyways. I did nearly all of this as a kid, and boy, I did not want to go through that again. And listen, I'm not opposed to some grinding. I have more hours in Destiny 2 than I care to admit. But when I've already beaten the game, already done the grind, already gotten the reward, going back and doing it again just is not appealing to me. I tried to do it just for the sake of this video, but I could not bring myself to finish. So anyways, that's my overly long and defensive excuse for not doing all the content in this game. Sorry, but I'll still speak on the stuff that I did. Also, I would be remiss not to acknowledge that the game does offer a large variety in its questing. While it is grindy, there are a lot of different ways to quest, which is very nice to see. If one of them doesn't suit your fancy, you can just go do something else, or whatever floats your boat. Of course, to get all the cool stuff, you will have to do everything. So first off, there's the battle arena. This is a really cool idea that the game introduced to the series, its spiritual successor being the bounties in Final Fantasy XII. Within the arena, you can fight any monster from the entire world simply by using the special hunting weapons to capture them. But the actual interesting fights are the unique monsters that can be battled after meeting certain conditions. For example, area monsters can be fought once all the monsters in a particular region have been captured. Some of these monsters offer some pretty great rewards too. Consumables that can teach Aeon's abilities or add strong perks to weapons or armor. In fact, the most powerful monsters in the game are found here in the monster arena, with some pretty crazy requirements to fighting them, like capturing every single monster in the game. Kitase himself has spoken on the extremely grindy nature of some of these quests. He said,
"As a game from that era, I don't regret it, but for example, if I were to recreate it today, I might think them through a little more."
Personally, I only did a few of these this time, basically just to get the footage. Aeons are much of the same, with the Anima Temple requiring every secret treasure being obtained from every temple, or Yoshimbo requiring an extremely large sum of money to acquire. Finally, the Celestial Weapons. Unlike in Final Fantasy VIII, where any weapons are craftable as soon as the materials are required, in 10, to craft Ultimate, aka Celestial Weapons, requires first completing a quest to unlock the capability of upgrading, then getting the weapon itself. But then, the weapon starts out basically useless, so you have to find 2 items that allow it to be brought to its full potential. Everything else aside, the Celestial Weapons are admittedly awesome, as the Ultimates usually are in every game. I love their designs here, I love their names, especially Kaldabog. Really sparked my imagination as a kid. But dear Lord, the grinding. Another thing I remember from my playthrough as a kid was trying to beat that fucking Chocobo trainer in the race to get a component for Titus's Kaldabog. But to get the upgrade component not only required beating them, you also have to finish with a final time of 0 minutes, 0 seconds. How is that possible, you ask? It fucking isn't. Case closed. Okay, no, it technically is possible, but it's also hell. Titus has to collect balloons throughout the race, which decreases his elapsed time and gather enough, and you can get that down to 0. All of that while also beating the trainer and also avoiding these dive-bombing birds that knock back the Chocobo and cause you to lose a few seconds. At least this playthrough I did was on an emulator and was able to keep loading save states to instantly start over when I made a mistake, and to make sure the course was always the same. Because, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the course is randomized and changes after every race, so good luck figuring out an optimal route, dickwad. And that's just one quest for one component. Remember, each weapon requires 2. Titus's celestial weapon is one of the main side quests that I actually completed this time, mainly because Kaldabog was always my favorite. Really, that's the only reason. But I didn't want people thinking that I avoided questing entirely. Only mostly. At least the other component is usually just hidden somewhere in the world, so that's not too bad. But, oh god, if the Chocobo race took a long time, then Waka's celestial weapon is just plain evil. It actually made me start to dislike one of my favorite parts of the game, Blitzball, which is a real shame. And that's about as good a segue as I could ask for to talk about this is one part of the game that I have absolutely no qualms with.
So that was a fucking lie.
Without a doubt, Blitzball is my favorite minigame in any video game ever, even edging out Gwent. It's just so damn creative and combines fast-paced action, especially if you're playing at double speed like me, with a challenge of tactics. There are just so many aspects that make it enjoyable. Apparently, though, I'm in the minority, as there was quite a bit of backlash against the minigame over the years. When asked about this criticism, Kitase said,
Blitzball was something that I pretty much created on my own. Half of it was for my own enjoyment as well. This was because we originally did not plan for it to be something that was necessary to play in order to progress the story, but to keep it as an optional feature, where only the players that wanted to play would take a detour and play. However, Blitzball eventually became a mandatory route for the story, and the game was changed so that you needed to play Blitzball in order to obtain a powerful weapon. I do feel sorry to have made some fans suffer because of this, but it would be appreciated if you could regard it as a characteristic of games from that era.
So I guess it was controversial because the game mode is not only required to get one of the celestial weapons, but also to progress the main story when the party goes to Luca. This rubbed some people the wrong way, but for the life of me, I can't sympathize because the game mode is just so fucking cool, especially for the time. Anyways, let's start with the basics of the game mode. Each player on your team has a bunch of different stats that determine their effectiveness in passing, shooting, catching, tackling, endurance, HP, etc. These basically work like a simple math game when used to determine whether or not an action will be successful. And you know my nerdy ass loves math. I even have a whole ass channel where I post some math lectures I've given. Check it out, Meromorphic Teaches. So for example, if Titus goes to shoot the ball and a couple opponents come to block him, their blocking stats will be deducted from his shooting stat. In addition, even after he gets through those opponents, the shooting stat slowly decreases as the ball travels further. If by the time the ball reaches the keeper, that shooting stat is still greater than the catching stat, including a small amount of randomness in either direction, then the goal will be successful. Otherwise, it gets blocked. And that goes the same for passing and defending in similar ways. But that's just the basics. Many things can modify stats to give you the upper hand. For example, players can learn new techniques by observing when other players use them during the game, and then add them to their repertoire for later use. These special techniques bolster their associated stat, So while Titus's normal shooting stat may only be 16, for example, his eject shot increases that stat to 21. I don't remember if those numbers are accurate, so please don't crucify me. But not only that, many techniques have an additional benefit. The eject shot, for example, knocks out up to 2 defenders to prevent them from lowering that shooting stat. It's the best technique in the game, hands down. Some others can put the opponent to sleep, or there's even some passive abilities that have a number of different benefits. Or if a certain player, I don't want to name any names, so let's make one up. We'll call him Letty. If Letty is terrible and awful, you can sign new players by traveling the world and recruiting them. Or you can just simply level up that player. Blitzball is pretty good at introducing the player to itself, except for the incessantly long tutorial at the beginning. There is a pretty gentle learning curve for new players that allows you to get acquainted with all the new mechanics until you have them all mastered. However, at the other end, the difficulty stops ramping up after a while. After getting my team leveled up through seasons and tournaments, I started absolutely demolishing teams who had no chance of blocking any of my overpowered shots or getting their own shots past my keeper. And that brings up a good point. There are 3 main modes of Blitzball: Exhibition, Season, and Tournament mode. Exhibition is basically just a free practice game, we don't care about it. Season is exactly what it sounds like, a full season of play, which is about 20 games, I believe. Only you can't ever see more than who your next opponent is. That's as far as the season info goes. You can't look ahead to find when the season will end or who future opponents will be. You kind of just have to keep track of it in your head, if you can. Otherwise, there's really nothing wrong with this mode. It rotates between the 5 possible teams, which is nice, and placing in the top 3 of the league nets you different prizes, including some of Waka's overdrives and some pretty rare items. Tournaments, on the other hand, are only 3 matches long, but again, the top 3 teams get a special prize. After so many league matches are played, new tournaments and prizes will be rotated in. This is where the bullshit comes in that I discussed at the very end of the last section regarding Waka's overdrive and celestial weapon. I don't really consider this a problem with Blitzball per se, it's more a problem with that celestial weapon quest. To even have a chance of getting the second upgrade material for Waka's weapon, the Jupiter Sigil, requires winning the league twice, as you have to win once just to get a 50-50 chance that the sigil will be the prize the next time through. So that's at least 40 games of Blitzball. But it's possible that it takes 60 or more if you have really shitty luck. Or if you're a dumbass like me that forgot to save scum before the last game of the season. That is a lot of Blitzball. And that number doesn't even include all the tournaments that you have to do to get the other overdrives required to get the one discussed above. Needless to say, it's a lot. So as much as I love this minigame, at the end of that grueling grind, I didn't want to touch the fucking mode again. In fact, all that time I spent in Blitzball was part of the reason why I couldn't be fucked to do a lot of the other side quests. But again, I can't really be mad at the actual game of Blitzball for that. The minigame is still fun as hell, even if I burnt myself out on it by playing so much. So, Squeenix, if I may be so bold as to make a suggestion, make a game dedicated to Blitzball, like CD Projekt did with Gwent. It would be fucking awesome, especially with updated graphics. It could have more teams, different rewards, and more free agent players, etc. Doesn't have to be anything huge, it could be even a mobile game. Do that and I promise you'll have at least one customer. If you, dear viewer, also want Square to make a Blitzball game, go ahead and comment below and join me into Screaming Into the Void and boost my engagement. Or we could just move on to the next section. One of the most notable things about Final Fantasy X is it's the first game in the series that doesn't have an overworld, at least to my knowledge. That was a bit disappointing, because one of my favorite things about Final Fantasy VIII was getting to roam around the world in the garden or the spaceship, especially to my kid self. There really isn't a way to openly traverse the world like that in 10, because there's no real world to explore. In its place is just a large interconnected set of pathways that, while beautifully rendered, don't offer quite the same euphoria as actually exploring a world, in my opinion. Traversing this world feels exactly like what it is, following a path from point A to point B. The closest we get to something like free exploration is the airship we get at the very end of the game. And that ship is basically just fast travel with an extra step. When you want to visit a new location, you have to first go to a save point to board the ship, and then choose your location from a list of previously visited ones, and then go to that location. It takes away all the fun of exploration while also being a more annoying fast travel. I guess, in a way, it is more immersive than normal fast travel because you're actually boarding a ship, which you are supposed to be using to travel, and you can move about the interior, so that's pretty neat. But immersivity at the expense of quality of life isn't great. Just look at Red Dead Redemption 2, where the devs decided to spend who knows how long animating realistic motions when looting things, only for people to hate it because after 100 or so times watching the same animation, you're just hoping for death, or at least a skip button. Quality of life is a higher priority, in my opinion. So 10's travel solution is kind of the worst of both worlds. There is an interesting feature which allows you to input coordinate points that let you visit secret areas. There aren't too many of these, but basically all of them have interesting rewards or challenges. So that's all well and good. Problem is, I have no earthly idea how one was supposed to find these coordinates without using a guide or Google, which is not so good. I feel like the entirety of the airship implementation would have been much cooler given an overworld and manual flight, much like previous titles. A lot was lost in changing that system. According to Katase, because of the complexity of creating a fully 3D world at the time, some things had to be cut to save costs. One of those things was indeed the overworld, which makes a lot of sense actually. It explains why the ship travel method feels kind of tacked on because, it kind of was. However, in return for what was lost, we got, as I mentioned before, a fully 3D world for the first time in a Final Fantasy game. In the previous 3D entries, while the characters and certain objects in the world were rendered in-game, basically all of the backgrounds were pre-rendered 2D stills that were just placed behind all of the actual 3D assets. Go back and play one of those games, and you will see this immediately. In fact, that's why the remasters look kind of shit for those games, because they apparently lost a lot of the background images. So while the 3D models have been updated, the backgrounds are just old scaled up JPEGs basically. So they're all stretched and pixelated. Point is, in early 3D Final Fantasy, the difference in quality between the character models and background was night and day. Rather than this being a cost-saving measure, it was simply a practical reality of developing for early 3D-capable consoles. There just wasn't much computing power to spread around. So if, for instance, they were to render the backgrounds fully 3D as well, then A, it likely would have not performed nearly as well, and B, even if it did, the backgrounds would just be these blocky, uninteresting messes. No shade on the developers, but the 3D models we got weren't exactly beautiful, even if there were improvements between 7 and 8. But finally, in 10, the devs had the power to make that fully realized, fully 3D world for the first time, and they did not squander the opportunity. While those backgrounds of the previous games were gorgeous, and definitely have a sort of nostalgic charm to them, I don't think there is any denying that a fully 3D world is just miles better, when done right, at least. It makes the immersion so much more visceral, because looking into the distance feels like, well, looking into the distance, and not just staring at a pretty picture of the horizon. Despite 10 being an early entry on the console, the detail of vegetation is pretty exquisite. With exceptions of places like Mushroom Rock or the Calm Lands or Mount Gagazet, the different areas feel full, vibrant, just alive. It feels like characters could finally actually live in this world instead of just being a facsimile, albeit a charming facsimile as in previous entries. And of course, the cutscenes, as always, are top of the line. This is one area that the Final Fantasy series has always excelled at, and 10 does not disappoint. As I said, that first entry into the port of Luca is just magical, but there are many other iconic moments from the game. The opening scene with Titus gracefully performing a flying kick out of the Blitzball water sphere, only to be disrupted by the visceral destruction of sin. Or the kiss between Titus and Yuna as they stand in the pond in the middle of the woods. These scenes are still gorgeous even by today's standards because the art design itself was just fundamentally good. Even if it doesn't benefit from the increase in fidelity that we've been accustomed to over the last 20 years, they're all just flat out awesome. Now, I didn't make music an entire section for this video because while I love and play music, I realized I don't have a lot of interesting things to say about it. Only got like 1 year into a music degree, so yeah, I'm no Davey 504. But just like the rest of the game, the nostalgia for the music here isn't quite as strong as it was for 8 for me. However, immediately on my playthrough, I did start to recognize some of it, and that itself unlocked a lot of deeply buried memories I had for this game. And the main reason for that, I think, is because the music is just so damn good. The game starts out on this hauntingly beautiful yet simple piano piece, To Xanarkand. You might have recognized that as the piece I played on the guitar at the beginning of this video. This track really gets across the mood of the final leg of the journey, just outside Xanarkand. Yuna resigned to her fate and Titus to his. The entire team tired and wary of what was to come. You can really hear that emotion in the music. Plus, I'm a sucker for simple piano tracks. The battle theme is just a variation on the one from 8 and I guess from other ones in the series, and that is just a fantastic song in itself. Many of the other tracks utilize a combination of piano and synthesized strings, playing different melodies. Seymour's battle music is a stellar example of this, having a super fast, arpeggiated melody. The temple music evokes worship, immediately bringing to mind religious imagery because of the Gregorian-style backing chants. So that's a pretty cool detail. The Game Over theme is this harpsichord piece, which I just love the randomness of. And there's this also full-on metal track called Otherworld, which kind of just comes out of nowhere. Oh, and I also love the Good Night theme, which is played on electric piano on extra crunchy mode. It's just so warm and comfy. It makes me want to curl up into a blanket and lie down. It kind of reminds me of a track that would be on Final Fantasy VIII, honestly. They aren't all bangers though. One that stands out in my mind especially is the Mihin High Road music that plays as you travel down the path. It's got this springy flexitone type sound. Not sure if that's actually the instrument, let me know in the comments. But yeah, there's something so infuriating about walking 2 steps, then getting into a random battle and then boingy 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 boingy. Okay, I'm done. Boingy boing. But overall, while I have some qualms about this game, from the structure of the world and the way it was implemented, and the sproing music, the way that the art team stylized things and brought that world to life is nothing short of astounding. It's pure art, and the more I learned about it and how it was made, the more I appreciated it. It's just so bright, with colors that really pop, making every area feel like a tropic paradise of a world, even if you're on a snow-packed mountain. But at the same time, there is this dissonance between what you see and what you hear, because the music is, in general, pretty melancholy. Either sad and wandering in some of the character scenes, or self-serious in the battles and temples. And I think that it's the clash between those two elements that creates something beautiful. It's what makes this game a classic. Despite my almost irrational great love for, well, everything about Final Fantasy VIII, I have to admit that the story of 10 is much deeper, the characters much more fleshed out. I still love 8 for what it is, and I don't think that will ever change. However, what did change was the immense respect that I now have for what 10 accomplished. I always loved the game, from the very first playthrough 20 years ago. But looking at it through a critical eye helped me to appreciate it much more than I had previously. And yes, that's why the title of this video says 20 years later and not 21. I am aware that it's been 21 years since the game has been released. Final Fantasy X just had so many groundbreaking firsts for the company that it's hard not to admire the pioneering developers that made it all possible. From the fully voice-acted dialogue, to the fully 3D rendered world, to the deepest storyline in the series to that point, and the even deeper characters. The game just has so much to offer, it's hard to play it and not feel something. Love, hate, excitement, sadness. There's just so much passion on display that it always affects me. As Kitase said,
We did not imagine how strongly the emotions of the story would reach our fans. It was also the first time that I shed tears with my own game during development.
we feel that emotion because the developers put their heart into this game. Those same feelings injected into its DNA. Just look at the symbolism and metaphor of the main story, of Titus and Jecht, of Sin and Spira as we have explored in this video, and realize that nothing half so deep was ever part of a Final Fantasy game before it. In fact, future games in the series would be hard-pressed to replicate this story. Case in point, the next mainline game, 12, is probably tied for my favorite in the series, right up there with 8, but the characters just aren't quite as interesting. It's for other reasons that I like it. Hell, just the fact that Square decided for the first time ever to make a direct sequel to 10, which is hilariously titled Final Fantasy X-2, should be enough indication of the impact that the game had on the community and the cultural zeitgeist. I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that word. All that said, for all its beauty, the game still has many flaws, which I have discussed here. And while overall, I think that the good outshines the bad, for my money, I still prefer 8 and 12. A lot of what was accomplished here, save perhaps the story and characters, was perfected in 12. I don't have any plans to talk about that game yet, though I guess now I kind of have to. Actually, I was planning on talking about it before, but I lost all the game footage from my playthrough, so yeah. That set me back. Regardless, though I may sound like a broken record, I have to respect everything that 10 accomplished, and its legacy, which still lives on to this day. To Kitase, Uematsu, and the rest of the people at Square who created this masterpiece, both my 12-year-old and 32-year-old selves would like to extend a warm thank you. And to any of you in the audience who have not given the game a try yet, I would highly recommend it, as you can probably tell. There is a remastered version out now, which looks great. I just played the original version so I could do it on my phone via a PS2 emulator, but from what I've seen, the remastered is really good. If you do end up playing it, come back and tell me what you thought. Thank you so much for watching this video. It was genuinely a lot of fun to make. From going back to the game, to writing the script, to editing this video. I enjoyed all of it, all 100 hours. Please support me on Patreon. Now I have a huge list of new patrons to thank because I got a bunch of newcomers after the Moral Oral video. So huge thank you to Trex Trend, Peter RJ, Isabella Stoner, Deep Void Chaos, Stacy Bava, Edgar Camarillo, Naomi Kuchiku Monroe, Bees Beth, Clued the Dude, Jose Stone, Glenn C., Eric Williams, Hope Kraus, Brendan Maddox, Matt Andrews, Xander, Elizabeth, Liz Alps, Greenie, Jed, Jarvis Alive, T-Lop, and Andy Hernandez. Thank you all so much. You rock, and I really appreciate your support. If you too would like to help support me in making these videos, you can also join my Patreon for as little as $2 a month, and you'll get a bunch of cool goodies along with it. Or you can just give me a super thanks here on YouTube. That's the little heart icon with the $sign down there. Anyways, next up is a shorter video on Before Oral. I'll see you all then.